3 weeks. That was how long the children of Caldera Flats had been calling Eli Dawson the orphan's shadow, before anyone thought to do a thing about it. 3 weeks of the boy trailing behind the others at recess, never quite close enough to be part of their circle, never quite far enough away to pretend he didn't care. He was 7 years old, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, and he had learned early that the world had edges that could cut you if you leaned too close. His father, Amos Dawson, had learned the same lesson in a harder school. Amos ran 40 head of cattle on a dry grass spread 2 miles east of town, on land that sloped toward a creek bed that only ran full in spring. He was 34 and had the look of a man who had once been capable of easy laughter and had simply run out of time for it. His wife, Clara, had died of a fever when Eli was barely 2, and the years since had been a long, quiet negotiation between grief and duty. Amos knew cattle, he knew fences and drought, and the particular ache of a north wind in November. He did not know how to explain to a 7-year-old boy why the other children stepped around him like he was a stone in the road. He had tried. Lord knows he had tried. He sat Eli down at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with a lamp between them, and asked, plain as he could, what was happening at school. Eli studied the grain of the wood and said nothing for a long while. Then he said, "They say I don't have a mama, so I'm only half a person." Amos felt those words settle in his chest like river gravel. He didn't answer right away. He stood up, put the kettle on, and stared out the window at the dark. After a moment he said, "That's not true." But both of them knew that the truth of a thing and the feeling of a thing were two very different animals, and no amount of saying so would close the distance between them. That was on a Tuesday. By Friday, Caldera Flats had a new schoolteacher. Her name was Grace Mercer, and she had come from 50 miles east with a trunk of books, a letter of recommendation from the territorial school board, and exactly $11 to her name. She was 28, unmarried, and possessed of the kind of practical calm that certain women develop when they have been left to solve their own problems long enough. She was not beautiful in the way that poets meant when they wrote that word, but she was striking in the way that competent people sometimes are. There was a directness in her gray eyes that made you feel, in her presence, that evasion would cost you more than it was worth. She arrived on the afternoon stage, stepped down onto the Caldera Flats Main Street with her trunk balanced behind the driver, and looked at the town the way a carpenter looks at a crooked wall, not with despair, with assessment. The schoolhouse was a single room at the north end of town, white painted and listing slightly to the left, where the foundation had settled. Inside it smelled of chalk and old wood, and the particular damp of a room that had been closed all summer. Grace stood in the center of it, turned a slow circle, and decided she could work with it. She met the children the following Monday morning. There were 14 of them, ranging from 5 to 12, and they filed in with the cautious curiosity of small creatures approaching something unfamiliar. Grace had arranged the desks in a slight arc rather than straight rows, which was the first thing any of them noticed. The second thing they noticed was that she had put a small clay pot of dried wildflowers on the corner of her desk, which no teacher before her had done. Eli Dawson came in near the back of the line, hands in his pockets, eyes down. He chose a desk at the far left of the arc, closest to the wall. Grace noticed him the way she noticed everything, quietly, completely, and without making a show of it. She learned all 14 names by the end of the first morning. That afternoon, she kept Eli back a moment after the others had gone. He stood in front of her desk looking like he expected trouble. Grace folded her hands and looked at him with those gray eyes and said, "I understand you've had a hard few weeks." Eli said nothing. His jaw had that set to it that Grace would come to recognize as the Dawson family's particular brand of dignity under pressure. "You don't have to talk about it," she said. "I just want you to know that in my classroom, every student belongs here. Every one. That includes you." She paused. "Now go on home. It's cold and your father's waiting." He went, but at the door he stopped and looked back at her, just for a moment, and something shifted in his face that wasn't quite trust yet, but was the shape trust makes before it arrives. Grace watched him go, then turned back to her lesson plan, and did not let herself think too hard about what she had just taken on. The following Thursday, Amos Dawson came to school. He came in the late afternoon, after the children had gone home, wearing a clean shirt that still had the fold creases in it from the last time it had been washed and put away. He knocked on the open door even though it was open. Grace looked up from the arithmetic papers spread across her desk. "Mr. Dawson," she said. He took his hat off. "Miss Mercer." He stood in the doorway with the low autumn sun behind him and looked like a man who had practiced what he was going to say and then lost confidence in it somewhere between the road and the door. "Eli told me you were kind to him," Amos said. "I wanted to thank you for it." "No thanks necessary," she said. "It's the job." He nodded. He looked around the room at the arc of desks, the wildflowers, the maps she'd pinned to the wall with careful precision. He was the kind of man who noticed how a room was kept. "It looks different than it used to," he said. "I expect it does." There was a pause. Outside, a wagon went by on the main road. The sound of it faded, and the room went quiet, in the way that rooms do when two people are both being careful. "I have a proposition," Amos said, and he said it with the directness of a man who had no talent for circling around things. "My housekeeper left in August, Mrs. Peel. She went to live with her daughter in Portland. I've been managing the cooking and the washing since then, and I'm not—" He stopped, looked at his hat. "I'm not succeeding at it, is what I'm saying." Grace set down her pen. "I see. Eli needs someone in the house. Someone steady. I can offer room and board and $10 a month above your school salary. Separate room, of course. A proper arrangement." He looked up. "I know it's not conventional." Grace looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the $11 in her pocket, the boarding house where she currently slept, in a room so cold she could see her breath in the mornings, the landlady who had made it clear that unmarried schoolteachers were a tolerated inconvenience and nothing more. She thought about Eli at the back of the line, eyes down, hands in his pockets. "What exactly would the arrangement involve?" she asked. "Cooking," Amos said. "A bit of washing, keeping the house in order. Nothing beyond the keeping of a household." "And your son, would I be expected to teach him, as you already do, and to be present? That's all I'm asking." He said it quietly. "The boy needs to see that a house can be a warm place. I'm not sure I've been doing a good enough job of showing him that." That last sentence was the most honest thing he had said, and they both knew it. Grace picked up her pen again, not to write anything, just to have something to do with her hands. "I'll want to see the room before I agree," she said, "and I'll want it understood that the arrangement is a practical one. Nothing more." "Understood," Amos said. "Nothing more." She came out that Saturday morning to look at the house. It was a long, low structure of unpainted timber, solid rather than pretty, with a covered porch that faced east and caught the morning light. Inside it was clean enough but spare, a kitchen with a good iron stove, a sitting room with 2 chairs, a table that could seat 4 but had only ever seated 2. The room she'd have was small, off the back hallway, with a window that looked out toward the creek bed and a hook on the wall where someone had once hung a coat. Grace stood in it and said, "This will do." Amos stood in the doorway. He looked relieved in the way that men who are not accustomed to asking for help look relieved when the asking turns out not to have cost them as much as they feared. She moved in the following Monday after school. Eli was standing on the porch when she came up the road with her trunk in the back of the school board's wagon. He watched her the whole way in with that careful, measuring look of his. When the wagon stopped, he came down the porch steps and stood next to it without speaking. Grace stepped down, looked at him, and said, "I'll need help with the trunk." He blinked. Then he stepped up and put both hands on the side of the trunk and pushed with everything he had, which was not enough to move it, but was offered with complete seriousness. Amos came around from the other side and lifted the bulk of it, and together the three of them got it inside. That evening, Grace made a pot of bean soup and a pan of cornbread, because those were practical things she knew how to do with what was in the larder. Amos came in from the barn and washed at the pump and sat down at the table without comment. Eli sat across from him and looked at the bowl in front of him, and then looked at Grace with an expression that was, very carefully, trying not to be hope. "Go ahead," she said. "It's ready." He ate 3 bowls. Amos ate 2 and said nothing, but when he pushed back his chair at the end of it, he looked at the table for a moment, and then at her and said, "That was good." It was not much, but in that house, at that time, it was a great deal. The weeks that followed had their own particular rhythm. Grace woke before the sun and had the stove going by the time Amos came in from checking the cattle. She made porridge or eggs or whatever the larder allowed. Eli would appear at the kitchen door still half asleep, his hair flattened on one side, and Grace learned not to speak to him directly until he had been awake for 10 minutes, after which he became communicative in the careful, qualified way of children who have learned to be cautious about what they say. She noticed the things the house needed: a loose hinge on the back door that banged in the wind, a curtain rod in the sitting room that had pulled free of the wall and was held up by a length of wire, a shelf in the kitchen that tilted and made the jars slide. She did not ask Amos to fix these things. She mentioned them once, in the evenings, when he was sitting with his accounts. He would look up, nod, and within 2 days the thing would be done. It was a form of conversation that suited them both. The children at school began to change toward Eli in ways that were gradual and not entirely explainable. Some of it was Grace's doing. She structured recesses and group work in ways that required the children to pair and shift partners, so that no one was permanently paired with anyone and no one was permanently excluded. Some of it was Eli himself, who, now that he came to school with warm food in him and a house that smelled like something other than dust and cold, had a steadiness about him that the other children found, in time, less foreign and more trustworthy. A boy named Thomas, who was 8 and had 2 older brothers and all the confidence that produced, started sitting near Eli at lunch. Not next to him at first, just near. Then, one afternoon, Thomas showed Eli a trick with a length of string that made a kind of cat's cradle, and Eli watched and then tried it, and the 2 of them sat bent over that piece of string for the better part of a quarter hour. Grace watched from the window and did not let her face show anything. At home, the evenings were quiet but no longer empty. Amos had taken to sitting at the kitchen table after supper rather than retiring immediately to his accounts, and Grace, who was correcting papers at the other end of the same table, did not remark on this. They did not speak much. But there was a quality to the silence that had changed. It was no longer the silence of a house that had given up on itself, but the silence of a house that was attending to something. One evening, Eli came to the kitchen with a book he had found in his room. It was a book of illustrated natural history, birds and insects and flowering plants, the kind of book that must have belonged to his mother, because it was too fine to have been Amos's. He put it on the table between Grace and Amos and said, "What's this one?" pointing to a picture of a bird with a red breast. Grace said, "That's an American robin. They come back every spring." Eli looked at the picture for a while. Then he said, "Do they always come back to the same place?" "Often enough," Grace said. He seemed to think about this. Then he closed the book and went to bed, and Grace and Amos sat in the kitchen without speaking for a while after that. It was Amos who finally said, quietly, "Clara's book. She brought it from Ohio." Grace did not look up from her papers. She said, "He found it on his own." "I know." A pause. "I wasn't sure whether to be glad about that or not." "I think you can be glad," Grace said. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then, With the deliberateness of a man deciding something, he said, "I am." It was the first time she had heard him speak about his wife and not sound like he was speaking from the middle of something unfinished. She noted it and said nothing and went back to her papers, and the lamp burned between them for another hour before either of them moved. The trouble, when it came in the form of a man named Virgil Cade. Cade was a land agent who worked for a company out of Boise that had been buying up water rights along the smaller creeks in the region. He had been in Caldera Flats for 2 weeks by the time Grace noticed him, a compact man in a good coat who smiled in the way of someone who had learned that smiling was useful. He attended church on Sundays. He had dinner at the hotel. He was, by all appearances, simply a man passing through. He was not simply passing through. He came to the Dawson spread on a Wednesday afternoon in early November, riding a horse that cost more than most men in the county spent in a year, and he brought with him a printed document that was very official in its language and very careful in what it offered, which was $300 for the water rights to the creek that ran through the eastern edge of Amos's land. Amos read the document at the kitchen table. Grace was there, correcting papers, as was usual. She read it over his shoulder without being invited to, and then went back to her chair and said nothing. Cade sat across from Amos with his hat on his knee and his smile in place. "It's a fair price," he said. $300 would see a man through a hard winter and then some. Amos set the document down. He looked at Cade with the measuring look he used when he was deciding how much of what he was thinking he wanted to say. "Without the creek water," he said, "I'd have to cut my herd by half by July." "You might," Cade said pleasantly. "Then $300 would see me through one winter and leave me broken come summer." Cade adjusted his smile slightly. "There may be room to negotiate." "There may be," Amos said. He stood up. He was not a large man, but he filled a room in the way that men do who are completely certain of where they are standing. "I'll want a lawyer to look at this before I say another word about it. You can leave the document." Cade left the document and left with his smile still on. Grace listened to the sound of his horse going down the road until it faded. Then she looked at Amos. "He'll be back," she said. "Yes," Amos said. "And he won't come alone the next time." Amos looked at her steadily. "No, he won't." There was something in that moment, in the plainness of it, the shared recognition of a threat and how it needed to be handled, that was more intimate than anything that had passed between them in 2 months. Grace felt it and looked back at her papers, and Amos sat back down, and neither of them said anything more about it just then. But Amos drove into town the next morning and spoke to the county land office, and then to a lawyer who practiced out of the back of the dry goods store, a small, bearded man named Fowler, who was sharper than he looked. Fowler read the document and said that the language in it was designed to make the water rights transfer permanent and irrevocable, that the $300 was roughly a quarter of what the rights were actually worth, and that Cade's company had done the same thing to 4 other properties in the county in the past 2 years. Amos brought this information back and told Grace that evening after Eli had gone to bed. She listened with her hands around her coffee cup and then said, "You need to talk to the other landowners. I know. And you need to do it before he comes back with a better document and a sweeter number. I know that too." He looked at her across the table. "You have a way of seeing things clearly." "I was raised to solve my own problems," she said. "It makes you practical." There was a silence. Then he said, "Grace," just her name, the way a person says a name when they are learning the weight of it. She looked at him. "I am glad you came here," he said. It was a plain sentence, not ornamented. He meant it as a plain thing. But his eyes held something that was not plain at all, something patient and careful and very much awake. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at her cup. "I'm glad of it too," she said quietly. Amos spoke to 4 neighboring landowners in the following week. Fowler drafted a letter to the county seat outlining the deceptive terms of Cade's company's contracts. 3 of the 4 men signed it. The 4th was tempted by the money, but his wife read the letter Fowler had written, and that was the end of Cade's chances with them. Cade came back on a Friday with 2 other men and a revised document. Amos met him on the porch, and this time Grace was at the doorway behind him, not forward of him, just present. Eli was inside, told to stay in the kitchen, which he did, though Grace later found boot marks on the windowsill where he had stood to watch. Amos told Cade about the letter to the county seat. He told him about Fowler. He told him, with the unhurried certainty of a man who knows his ground, that he had no intention of selling any right to any water on his property, and that he would be grateful if Cade and his company would direct their attentions elsewhere. Cade's smile became a different kind of smile. He said there might be other ways this could go. Amos said he expected there might be, and that he was prepared for them. The 2 men with Cade looked at the porch and the house and the woman in the doorway, and at Amos, who had not moved, and something passed between them that was the private arithmetic of men, deciding whether something is worth the trouble. They rode out. Amos stood on the porch for a moment after they were gone. Then he turned to look at Grace. He said, "Thank you for being there." "You didn't need me there," she said. "No," he said, "but I wanted you there." He said it simply, the way he said everything. And he looked at her with that patient, awake look, and Grace felt something shift in her chest, in a way that had nothing to do with a practical arrangement, and everything to do with the fact that she was standing on a porch in November, with a man who had just told her, in the quietest possible way, that she mattered to him. The next weeks were easier. Cade's company redirected its attentions north, as Fowler had predicted they would when they met resistance. The letter to the county seat generated an inquiry that Fowler said would likely come to nothing, but would slow the company down considerably. The weather turned hard in December, the first real cold snapping down from the north and glazing the water in the pump trough each morning. Grace added a second quilt to Eli's bed and taught him to bank the stove at night so the kitchen held its warmth until morning. He was a quick learner, Eli. He learned things with a quiet thoroughness, the way his father did. Thomas had become, by this time, something that could properly be called Eli's friend. The 2 of them walked to school together and home again, and on Saturday mornings Thomas sometimes came to the Dawson place, and the 2 of them could be found in the barn, engaged in projects of uncertain purpose that involved a great deal of rope and not a great deal of common sense, as boys' projects tend to. Grace let this proceed without interference, because there are things that friendship teaches that no school teacher can, and a boy building foolish structures with a friend is learning something essential. On a Saturday in late December, Grace came in from hanging washing to find Amos in the sitting room with a chair. Not sitting in a chair, working on one. It was a straight-back chair with a wobbly left leg that had been wobbly since she'd arrived, and he had it upside down on his knee and was fitting a new wooden peg into the joint. He looked up when she came in. He said, "I know you've had to set books on the floor. The leg was loose." Grace set down her washing basket. She looked at the chair and at the care with which he was fitting that joint, patient and precise. She thought about all the small repairs he had made since she'd come, the door hinge and the curtain rod and the kitchen shelf, all of them done quietly after she'd mentioned them once, all of them done with the same thoroughness. "Amos," she said. He looked up. "This arrangement we have," she said, "I want you to know that I don't think of it the way I did in October." He was still. He set the chair down, right side up, carefully. He said, "How do you think of it?" She had rehearsed this less than she should have, which meant she said it plainly, which was probably the right way. "As a life," she said, "if that's something you would want." He looked at her for a long time. The room was quiet. Outside, Eli and Thomas were somewhere in the barn making noise that could be heard faintly through the wall, a distant thumping, and a burst of laughter. Amos said, Grace. And then he said, I have wanted to say something to you since November. I couldn't find the right way to start. You've started, she said. He rose from the chair. He crossed the room to where she was standing and stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the particular warmth in his dark eyes, the same eyes Eli had, and he said, I'd like for you to stay, not as a housekeeper, as... He stopped. He had run out of the careful language and was into the real language. As mine, he said, if you'll have me. Grace looked at him steadily. She thought about a room with a hook on the wall and a window toward the creek. She thought about a 7-year-old boy pushing at a trunk with everything he had. She thought about lamplight on a kitchen table and the quiet of 2 people attending to something together. I'll have you, she said. He took her hands. It was a simple thing. His hands were rough from work and very warm, and he held hers with a careful deliberateness, as if he was establishing something that was going to last. Outside, Eli's laughter came through the wall again, clear and unself-conscious in a way it had not been in October, and Amos heard it and something came into his face, relief and gratitude, and the private joy of a father who has watched his child come back from a far country, and Grace saw all of it and thought that this was the thing she had been building toward without knowing she was building toward it. They were married by the Reverend Tibbs on the first Saturday in January in the little church at the center of Caldera Flats, with Eli standing beside his father in a clean shirt that had been pressed that morning by Grace. Thomas was there, and Fowler, and most of the town, because small towns do not allow a thing like this to happen quietly. There was cake afterward, and Thomas ate more of it than could reasonably be considered polite, and nobody minded. On the walk home, Eli came between Amos and Grace without being asked to, and he took one hand from each of them, and the 3 of them walked like that down the January road, while the sky went gold over the creek, and the cold air was clean and still, and full of the particular silence that follows when something has been settled at last. That night, after Eli was in bed, Grace stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark. Amos came and stood beside her. He said, "What are you thinking about?" She said, "Robins." He looked at her. "They come back," she said. Eli was right to ask about that. Amos put his arm around her shoulders and they stood there in the kitchen light while the cold pressed quietly at the glass, and the house held the warmth that 2 people working together can make, which is a different and deeper warmth than any single person can produce alone. There is a kind of belonging that isn't given to you. It isn't written into any contract or born into any blood. It is built, piece by piece, in the small and ordinary moments. A bowl of bean soup, a repaired chair leg, a boy's laugh through a wall, 2 names said simply in a winter room. You cannot rush it, you cannot purchase it, but you can earn it, and when you have, it becomes the most permanent thing in your life. If you have ever felt like the orphan's shadow, like you were standing just outside the circle of warmth that other people seem to enter without effort, then this story was told for you tonight, because sometimes the bargain you make in desperation is the door to the very thing you were always meant to find. And sometimes a woman with $11 and a trunk of books walks into a tilting schoolhouse and changes everything, not because she set out to save anyone, but because she simply refused to leave anyone behind. Tell us in the comments, have you ever found belonging in a place you didn't expect? We read every one of your stories and they matter to us more than you know. If this journey touched your heart tonight, please subscribe and stay with us, because there are many more stories waiting on this road, and we would love to walk them with you. Good night. God bless you and yours, and may you always find your way home.